Hello, thank you for joining us today. I'm Chris Koger, Managing Editor of Fruit Growers News. Today's webinar, Apple Production Challenges and Solutions, A Global Perspective, is brought to you by ICL. Our guests today are Dr. Jason Haegele, ICL's North American Agronomy Lead, and Dr. Deanna Wieczorek, ICL, Key Agronomist and Sales Support for Poland and the Baltics.
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
We'll be tapping into ICL's network of more than 200 agronomists, talk about the challenges with balancing nutrient levels, better pit, high prices of inputs, and market fluctuation are common for apple producers across the globe. This webinar is eligible for 1 CEU credit, and at the end of the webinar, there's going to be a QR code for you to scan. So if you have any questions anytime throughout the webinar, just feel free to ask them in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen, and we'll be sure to get those, as many of those as possible throughout the webinar. So right now, I'd just like to welcome our guests, Drs. Jason and Deanna. Welcome.
Thank you, Chris.
Welcome.
So appreciate everyone joining us this afternoon for this discussion about apple production challenges and solutions from a global perspective. ICL is a global company with operations and market presence all across the globe. And frankly, that's one of the things that I've enjoyed most working for ICL is the opportunity to learn from colleagues who are based in other parts of the world. Certainly agronomy is a local decision when it comes to identifying solutions and the products that are used to address those solutions. But what I'm constantly amazed of is that there are reoccurring themes or challenges all across the world, and specific to apples, reoccurring challenges, whether that's the North American market, the Eastern European and Polish market, as we'll talk about today, in other parts of the world as well. And I'd like to especially thank Diana for joining us this afternoon, because I believe in her part of the world it's 8 p.m. so it's very late in the day, and really appreciate her expertise in joining us this afternoon. So let's go on to the next slide, please. So for those who aren't familiar with ICL, ICL is not a new company globally, and not a new company to the North American market either. In fact, ICL has been around for over 100 years at this point, having started over 100 years ago at the Dead Sea in Israel. Established to extract or mine minerals from the mineral-rich waters of the Dead Sea, particularly potassium, but also magnesium and bromine. And over the last 100 years, ICL has grown into leading global specialty minerals company. Not only focused on agriculture, but also solutions for food industries and industrial products as well. And Diana and I both work for the ICL Growing Solutions business, which is the specialty fertilizer division within ICL. Next slide, please. Globally, ICL has a very extensive portfolio of products, which enables us to provide a comprehensive suite of growing solutions for different crops, including apples. Within the North American market specifically, we have a presence in ornamental horticulture with brands like Osmocote, Peter's Professional, in the specialty agriculture market with lines like Polysulphate, Nova water solubles, Agrocote, control release fertilizers, and then Agrolution water soluble NPK. If we look more globally, there are many other brands and solutions that are available within ICL. And so some of the examples that we'll be talking about today as we address challenges and solutions, and how different specialty fertilizer products are used to address those solutions, may reference products like AgriLeaf, which is a foliar feed product that is available in other parts of the world, but may give you some ideas of how to best manage apples for different agronomic challenges that are being experienced. Okay. So we've divided our presentation into really two key areas, focused on establishing new apple orchards and some of the challenges and considerations of getting apples off to a good start. And then also we'll talk about apple fruit quality, specifically calcium nutrition, and how that can be used to not only increase yield but also increase quality. Before we get into those different challenges and solutions, Diana is going to provide a little bit of a background on apple production in Eastern Europe and Poland specifically, to set the context for this global knowledge that we're assembling to provide solutions to global challenges for apple production. So if we go to the next slide, we'll turn it over to Diana, and she can talk more about apple production in the European context.
Yeah, thank you. Before we move on the presentation of the experimental results, I would like to say a few words about Polish apple production. Because Poland is the largest apple producer in Europe and the fourth in the world after China, United States, and Turkey. In 2022, the total cultivation apple area in Poland was 151,000 hectares, and the harvest production, it was 4,264,000 tons. So you see the numbers. Poland is the largest apple producer in the European Union. Next slide, please. On the map, you can see the on the map of Europe, you can see the location of Poland and its share in European apple production. And what does it look like with the division of districts? The largest apple production concentrate in the central part of Poland, in Mazowieckie district, in Lubelskie, Łódzkie, and Świętokrzyskie, also have a large share in production. Next slide, please. In Poland, we have a few main apple varieties. It is Red Jona Prize, Gala, Champion, Ida Red, Jona Gold, Golden Delicious, and Red Delicious. And because Poland have a long tradition with apple cultivars, we have high density orchard and low density orchard, new ones and old ones. Depends of the group of varieties, apple trees growing poorly, apple trees moderately growing, and apple trees growing slowly. It depends of the rootstock. Apple plantations choose the best spacing when they cultivate their plants. Next slide, please. What was the main problems for fruit growers in 2023? Poland is located in the temperature climate zone, so frost very often occur in the first day of May, which are very dangerous for blooming apple trees. Flower buds damage during this period fall, resulting in a decrease on yield. There are more and more Gara and Red Delicious apple trees in Polish orchards, so frost damage these varieties, result in the subsequent development of bark and wood disease, leading to the dead and short branches and even entire trees. Of course, Polish plantations need to fight with them using the special products with sugars, with phosphorus, spraying water the apple plantation, but sometimes the frost can destroy the buds. And in 2023, our plantation have huge problem with apple scab because of the weather. This disease comes very early, and they don't have enough time to use fungicide. So during the harvest time, many fruits must be sent to the industry, not for the fresh market. Next slide, please.
Okay.
And Jason, the frost.
Yes. Yeah, thank you for that background. And so now as we transition into some of the specific examples of challenges and solutions, it's all really focused around this idea of balanced nutrient delivery for optimum plant growth, yield and quality. This concept is common and applicable to all crops, not just apples. But as I think about the changes that are occurring in crop management and plant nutrition management in general, we're getting away from the focus on macronutrients only, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, and also thinking about how to address other nutrients like secondary macronutrients, micronutrients, trace elements, etc. And that balance isn't just about the right rate. It really considers all of the the 4 R's, if you will: the right rate, the right time, place, and source. And so as we go through some of these examples and talk about, specific, products that, either Diana has used in Poland or, we've, focused on here in the US, they may simply be, different ways to supply, familiar nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus, but do it in a way that provides this optimum balance for plant growth at different times during the development of an apple orchard, whether it's early in the production cycle of an apple orchard as the trees are getting established, or potentially later as we're getting into the the fruiting years of the orchard and trying to maximize not only yield but also the quality of the fruit that is coming off of that orchard. Next slide, please. The first section that we're going to focus on is this idea of managing new plantings of apple orchards, and in particular high density orchards as one example from North American production. Often one of the goals in establishing a new orchard is to get the orchard or the crop off to a good start, so that apple production and revenue generating production from the orchard can happen as quickly as possible. But to do that, we potentially need to consider different types of nutrient sources. Diana will talk about controlled release fertilizers, particularly controlled release nitrogen is one tool to establish new trees. And then I'll also talk about fertigation, particularly fertigation of phosphorus and potassium containing fertilizers as one way to enhance that early growth of trees in the orchard, but also potentially set the orchard up with a strong foundation for continued productivity and revenue over the long course and life of that orchard. Next slide.
Nitrogen is the most important nutrient for all the plants. We decide to spoke on the nitrogen because our test showing us the good nitrogen effect for the established new apple plantation. There is no single nitrogen program that is correct for all orchard situation, but while low nitrogen be a problem for most tree crops, extensive crops can be a problem with the bad quality. Which factors can influence from the affecting nitrogen program? This is the plant density, bearing, non-bearing trees, nitrogen requirements by variety, plant growth, and pruning. Next slide, please. I add one slide with foliar nitrogen fertilization, because in Poland we have 60% irrigated orchards, but only 30% is fertigated. So the most important way to putting the fertilizers to the trees, it's soil and foliar fertilization. So that's why I would like to speak in some words about the nitrogen foliar fertilization, because in Poland we recommended using this nutrient in 3 times: before flowering for improving the fruit setting, after flowering for improving the conditions of the trees, and after harvest, because we would like to build the reserve of the nitrates from the next season. And during this time after harvest, of course, not only nitrogen is necessary, the plants needs, for example, zinc, magnesium, and boron. So the foliar fertilization is the best way to get these nutrients to the plants and to the trees. Next slide, please. Some years ago, we established some trials with Agromaster and Agroblen to investigate how controlled release fertilizer will positively influence the establishment of young plantation of apples. It was new apple plantation, Yona Gold variety. We tested 2 ICL solutions. At first was Agroblen applied at planting into the planting holes, and the second solutions applied during the second and third year of the vegetation of the vegetation period was the Agromaster. Agromaster were applied along the rows of the trees, and Agromaster contains coated and uncoated urea and additionally phosphorus and potassium. These products we sell in all Europe with different compositions, depend of the country, depend of the plants. Of course, we add control with no fertilizer, and we add the grower practice. It was the conventional NPK fertilizers. We measure trunk diameter, total shoot length, SPAD, and number of flowers and yield. Next slide, please. On this table, you can see the differences between conventional NPK fertilization and agroblend during the first year. So using agroblend, you can reduce the product dosage by 50%, nitrogen dosage by 50%, phosphorus dosage by 69%, and potassium dosage by 74%. Additionally, you can reduce the number of applications by one. On the second and third year, our experiment, we additionally add Agromaster 2-3 months longevity, 70% nitrogen coated, and we reduce the product dosage by 19%. The phosphorus dosage by 11%, and the number of application by one. Next slide, please. On this slide, you can see how the experiment looks like. It was the sandy loam soil. It was only irrigated, not fertigated. As you see, I think that this orchards looking similar that in United States, so I didn't see any differences between Jason and me photos. Next slide. What was the assessments? When you see of the total annual should grow, we got better results using Agroblend and Agromaster in the first year, and the second year after experiment was establishment. The same looking for the trunk diameter and number on inflorescence and SPAD. It was the physiological and parameters which showing us how Agromaster and Agroblend can work on apple plantation. Next slide, please. And what was the most important for the farmer is the yield. And when we compared to conventional fertilizers, yield per trees increased by 19% in the second year, and for by 59% in the third year after plantation. So the results look very good, and showing that these solutions get the farmers very, very good effects. Next slide, please. What was the conclusion of these trials? In the first year at plantings, thanks to 100% coated nitrogen provided by Agroblend, because Agroblend contains 100% nitrogen coated, the level of nitrogen and number of applications were reduced by 50%. In the first 2 years after planting, Agroblend and Agromaster improves total annual shoot growth and trunk diameter by 6% and 24% respectively. And in the following years, reduction of the level of nitrogen by 20%, and with only one application, Agromaster provides the best result with respect to the number of inflorescence and final yield by 19% and 59% in the second year and third year. Next slide.
Thank you, Diana. And before we proceed to the next topic, one question, you started to introduce this idea with the explanation of Agroblend being 100% coated. What is the for the listeners, what is the difference between Agroblend and Agromaster in terms of coating characteristics? We'll continue on. So the kind of continuing on this idea of establishing new orchards and managing orchards. In the U.S. in particular, there's greater emphasis on fertigation of orchards. In some areas, like Michigan, that historically have not been irrigated production areas. And so with that, comes a learning curve for, understanding, how to use, irrigation and fertigation, or the application of nutrients, through the irrigation water. And in particular, some of the challenges with fertigation are, knowing which fertilizers that are compatible or incompatible. And so, for example, calcium and phosphorus is a classic example of two nutrients that are typically not compatible in solution, or in the soil for that matter. And then other considerations include the quality of the water that is coming from an irrigation well, or potentially surface water sources like an irrigation pond. Particularly with well water, the alkalinity of the water, or the dissolved minerals like calcium and magnesium become considerations, as well as the pH of the water. Collectively, these characteristics of alkalinity and dissolved minerals can reduce the availability of nutrients like phosphorus, or they can lead to the accumulation of precipitates over time, as that high alkalinity hard water is emitted through a drip system, as one example. Next slide, please. So one of the trials that we've done with our unique PEC acid product has been on apples in Michigan. And as a little bit of background, PEC acid is a water-soluble fertilizer produced by ICL in Israel. It has an analysis of 0,60,20, and really what makes this product unique is that it is very acidic in solution. So 1% solution of NovaPEC acid typically has a pH around 2.2. In essence, you can think of PEC acid as a dry crystalline form of phosphoric acid, but also has the potassium nutrient in there as well. And so we began this trial over 3 years ago, following a newly planted orchard for 3 consecutive years between 2021 and 2023. This orchard would have been at fourth leaf in 2023, this past year, and these were a new Fuji orchard. This trial had 4 different treatments. Control treatment that was no irrigation or fertigation, so it was completely dependent on rainfall for water, as well as the grower standard practice for dry fertilizer applied in the spring. We had irrigation only, so drip irrigation with water only. A grower standard fertigation practice, which was a liquid product with an analysis of 3-17-17 applied, 5 gallons per acre per event. And then the ICL fertigation program, which used PEC acid as the phosphorus and potassium source at 20 pounds per acre per fertigation event, and then urea ammonium nitrate, 28% UAN, as a nitrogen source to balance the nitrogen between the grower standard fertigation practice and then the ICL fertigation practice. Although we were able to balance the nitrogen between these 2 treatments, there was more phosphorus applied with the PEC acid treatment, due to being particularly rich in phosphorus, or high in concentration, and then slightly more potassium applied with the grower standard fertigation practice, or the liquid 3-17-17. So not a apples to apples comparison, no pun intended, for the 2 fertigation programs, but we were looking at the impact of these different treatments over the course of these 3 years on leader growth in these newly planted trees. These were 9 fertigation applications per year, replicated 3 times, and then 25 trees per replication. Next slide, please. So this is the overall result across these 3 years for this new apple orchard, where we had these different treatments, the fertigation treatments, water alone, and then the non-irrigated control. If you look at the table on the right, we have the percent of trees reaching the top wire after 3 years in the trellising system. So while it wasn't significantly ahead of the other treatments, PEC acid did come out on top at nearly 87% of trees reaching the top wire after 3 years. The grower standard fertigation practice was at 85% after 3 years. Water alone was 84%, and perhaps the bigger difference, showing the value of drip irrigation, even in an environment that does receive rainfall throughout the summer, is 71% for the non-irrigated versus 85 to nearly 87% for the various irrigated and or fertigated treatments. Similarly, if we look at the average cumulative leader growth in inches, On the far right column, the pec acid, numerically came out on top at nearly 92 inches of growth versus 89 to 90 inches for the irrigated and grower standard fertigation, and then only 77 inches for the non-irrigated control. The other thing that I would draw your attention to in the graph on the left is with the ICL pec acid treatment, it started out slow relative to the other treatments in the first year, but certainly as we got into the second year, 2022, and then in 2023, that fertigation program was performing quite well compared to the grower standard fertigation program, as well as the water only control. And so part of that I would attribute to the acidifying effects of pec acid, which are likely neutralizing bicarbonates in the irrigation water, and helping to mitigate some of that buildup of precipitates or undesirable soil chemistry that occurs or often occurs over time in irrigated cropping systems, drip irrigation in particular, where we're concentrating those effects in a relatively small area compared to other types of irrigation that rely on sprinklers or broadcast over a broader area. Next slide, please. So the next topic that we're going to transition into is a conversation about fruit quality and bitter pit, and this seems to be a reoccurring theme all across the world, not only in North America but Europe and other areas as well. For many apple varieties, but at least in the North American context, Honeycrisp is a key target for improving fruit quality, especially associated with disorders like bitter pit. And so we're going to come at this from two different angles. Diana is going to talk about the use of foliar nutrition, an agroleaf foliar product in Poland for improving yield and fruit quality. And then I will talk about a soil applied approach, specifically polysulphate, that supplies 4 nutrients, including calcium, to help either increase yield or ideally increase fruit quality. Next slide, please. Diana, you're on mute.
Okay, thank you. We start speaking on the calcium and calcium necessary on the April plantation. I think that every one of us know that calcium plays a key role in fruit quality, improving fruit firmness, storage potential, and preventing physiological disorders. Cell wall integrity and cell-to-cell adhesion is improved, resulting in a toucher flesh that is less prone to breaching on tissue breakdown. Leaf tissue analysis frequently shows a need for higher calcium level, and the foliar calcium application is the faster and in many cases the cheaper way to add calcium to the plants to reduce the physiological disease. How is the calcium uptake symptoms? This is the bitter pit, cork spot, and senses breakdown during storage. Next slide, please. What is the best time for the calcium fertilization as foliar fertilizer? It's depending on the variety. Typically is 3 to 7 application of foliar calcium during the vegetation period. In hot and dry summers, the numbers of treatments should be increased, similarly with weaker fruiting and intention to storage the fruit for a long time. The first treatments I recommended when the fruits reach the size of a walnut. In Poland, it's June when the first calcium application should be done. Subsequent treatments with calcium should be performed at intervals of 7, 10, 14 days. And the type of and the dosage of calcium fertilizer should be adjusted to the development phase of trees, starting with smaller doses and increase them with the age and size of trees. And in Poland, for example, we have experience with many calcium contains products because our farmers use calcium sulfate, calcium nitrate, calcium with amino acid, and other calcium sources. So we know that when the farmers using amino acid with calcium by foliar application, they must use these products very earlier from the on the one stage phase, because when they use in the end of the vegetation period, they can prolong the maturation of the fruits. So when the farmers needs fruits, for example, of September and October, sometimes there are not possibility to harvest the plants. So from my side, the best solutions is AgroLeaf Power Calcium. That's why we start to do trials with these products. Next slide, please. We tested our AgroLeaf Power Calcium on 2 orchard plantation. The first one was 5 years old plantation, Golden Delicious variety. And the second one was 21 years old plantation, Idaret variety. It was professional. These trials were made by professional independent Institute for Horticulture in Skierniewice. We tested control without any fertilizers. Grower practice was our conventional NPK foliar fertilizer, and we tested our AgroLeaf Power Calcium. We used 6 applications per season from June to August, with dosage 5 kg per hectare. The number of spraying water volume was between 100 to 1000 liters per hectare. And this experiment was prepared in 3 replication. The measurement on this trial was very huge. We measured not only yield, but fruit size, average fruit weight, fruit skin color, content calcium and potassium in the fruit. But on this presentation, I'll show you the most interesting results. Next slide, please. The most important things from all the farmers is yield. So using the AgroLeaf Power on the 5-year yield old Golden Delicious plantations, you can increase the yield. And the same results we got on the Idaret 21-year-old plantation, but the results not was the statistic, not was the differences not was huge. And additionally, we measure the size of the fruits. And what was observed that using AgroLeaf Power, you can decrease the number of huge and large fruits compared to grower practice and compared to no fertilization plots. The same we observe on the old one plantation with Idaret variety. The number of large fruits were higher compared to grower practice. Next slide, please. What was interesting on these trials, that calcium content in the fruit tissue was higher on the Golden Delicious plots. The same results we got with the Idaret variety. So AgroLeaf Power have very good calcium, with which is very fast uptake by the plant. And using these products, you can reduce the physiological disease in the A+, because AgroLeaf Power contains not only calcium, contains nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and magnesium. And this is only one product in Polish market which contains all these nutrients in one composition. So we measured the potassium contents in the fruit tissue too. And what surprised us, that the number of potassium after AgroLeaf Power application, that in the young plantation was lower than compared to grower practice, but from the oldest plantation, potassium content in the fruits was higher, but potassium influence from the sugar content stimulate the color in the A plus. So it's not important nutrients from the physiological disease, from the reduction of physiological disease. Next slide, please. And conclusion after finish these trials. A positive effect of agroleaf fertilizer application on fruit size was measured for idirect cultivars. The biggest fruits, more than 8 centimeter in diameter, were obtained from the trees which were treated with agroleaf products. Generally, the content of calcium in fruit tissue was low, but in idirect, the highest calcium content was measured in the fruits harvest from the trees treated with agroleaf fertilizers. Next slide, please.
All right, thank you, Diana. And before we go on, you mentioned that agroleaf not only contains calcium but contains other nutrients as well. Beyond the nutrients, are there any special formulation characteristics of agroleaf that make it particularly well suited as a foliar product? So, for example, are there surfactants or other components within agroleaf?
Sorry, because I start to read our questions. So can you repeat your?
Yes, beyond the nutrients that are in agroleaf, the calcium, and then the other macro and micronutrients that you mentioned, are there specific formulation components of agroleaf that make it particularly well suited for foliar application? For example, are there surfactants or other ingredients that help with the uptake of the nutrients?
In Poland, typically farmers use the adjuvants with the foliar fertilizers, but sometimes when we spoke about the amino acid, then can improve the calcium uptake. But we must use these products very earlier. So not exist in Poland market any product who stimulate the calcium uptake by the leaf.
Okay, thank you. And Chris, are there other questions that we want to address at this time before we move on to our final section?
Here I go. Yeah, we do have a question from Greece, from a nutrition specialist there. Under high salinity water problems, what's the best practice to fertigate? This is also a two-part question. And what is the foliar applications is a reliable solution under those salinity problems?
That's a great question, and salinity is definitely a difficult challenge. In many parts of the world, in the U.S. we have that challenge in parts of the Western U.S. and it can be difficult to to manage effectively. I think one of the unknown questions that makes it difficult to respond is understanding the level of salinity and sodium levels, chloride levels, etc. And the other unknown is whether there's also potentially rainfall at specific times during the year that can help with leaching those salts from the soil. But what I would say is that in fertigation, particularly micro irrigation, where we're concentrating that water in a small area, those salinity effects tend to build up locally in that zone of application relatively rapidly, and it can be important sometimes to consider approaches like gypsum application of the soil that help to remediate salts and specifically displace sodium, but also having the availability to periodically leach those salts through the water, whether that's through increased volume of water through irrigation or potentially through rainfall that occurs at different times of the year. So for example, in California, it's a very dry irrigation dependent environment during the summer months. But hopefully, ideally, there's rainfall during the winter months that can help to leach some of those salts and move them below the root zone. And in terms of a foliar application, again, I think it kind of depends on the nature of the salinity, but that could be a consideration for specific crops. It's going to vary by crops and their tolerance to high salinity in the water being applied to the foliage. So continuing on this idea of calcium nutrition, we're going to shift our focus to soil applied calcium and soil applied secondary macronutrients in general. And as a reminder, those secondary macronutrients are sulfur, calcium, and magnesium. Specific to calcium, there are different types of soil applied sources for calcium. Gypsum, calcium sulfate is a common one in many crops. Thinking about specialty crops, fruiting crops, there are crops like potatoes, calcium nitrate or calcium ammonium nitrate, can be commonly used sources of soil applied calcium. And then specific to ICL and the examples that I'll provide, polysulphate, which is a product name, or the mineral itself, polyhalite, is a good source for supplying all three of the secondary macronutrients: sulfur, calcium, and magnesium, but also for supplying potassium in a low chloride form. So if we go to the next slide, please. Polysulphate does contain these four nutrients that I've just mentioned. Sulfur, approximately 19% in the sulfate form, potassium, 14% potassium oxide, magnesium 3.6%, and calcium 12.2%. All of these mineral elements, the calcium, the magnesium, and the potassium, are in the sulfate form. So on the one hand, that makes them more available to the plant compared to potentially other sources of mineral nutrients. But even though they are in the sulfate form, the mineral structure of the mineral polyhalite, or what we call polysulphate, releases these nutrients, and it releases sulfur in a gradual, sustained fashion across the growing season, which enables it to match up with the uptake requirements of an annual crop that is planted in the spring, or match up with the uptake requirements of perennial crops as they grow and develop throughout the season. Polysulphate contains potassium, again 14% K2O, but this potassium is low chloride, about 2.5% on average in the analysis, compared to something like potassium chloride or potash that's in between 45 and 48% chloride in its composition or makeup. Next slide. So this is what gets us really excited about the agronomic characteristics of polysulphate compared to other sulfur sources, or sulfate sources in particular. If you look at the graph on the right side of the screen, we have different curves depicted here. The curve labeled number 1 is depictive of sulfate release from very readily available, plant available, soil available forms of sulfate, like ammonium sulfate, AMS, or potassium sulfate, SOP. And so the point is that when we apply these products to the soil, they're exposed to moisture. They break down very quickly, making that sulfur or other nutrients, nitrogen in the case of ammonium sulfate, available to the plant. That can be an advantage, depending on when these nutrients are applied. But thinking about a springtime application as an example, under high rainfall or sandy, coarse textured soils, that sulfate can also become less available to the plant through the process of leaching. The other extreme on this graph is the sulfate release from calcium sulfate or gypsum. So that's the straight line at the bottom. And calcium sulfate is a good source of calcium. It's a good source of sulfur, but it takes time to break down and release its nutrients to the crop. It can be a good foundation for the crop for providing calcium or sulfur. But if we want to depend on calcium sulfate for ensuring that these nutrients are available to the crop exactly when it needs it, it may not always be the best option. The curve label number 2 is sulfate release from polysulphate. And so because polysulphate, or the mineral polyhalite, is a mixture of associations between magnesium, calcium, and potassium with sulfate, these associations break down at different rates, making that sulfur available over a long period in the growing season. In this graph, we're showing that relative to sulfur uptake by an annual crop, soybeans as an example, which isn't necessarily relevant to apples, but it illustrates the point that the sulfur release and the release of the other nutrients within polysulphate more closely matches crop demand through the growing season. Again, whether that's an annual crop planted in the spring, or a perennial crop that is developing or fruiting throughout the season. The other point on the screen, or this slide, is the calcium release depicted at the bottom. This is again comparing polysulphate and gypsum as calcium sources. It's different rates of product being used. Polysulphate at 750 pounds, which is much higher than what is commonly used in practice. But the idea there is that there's a high amount of nutrients available to the crop, even higher amount of gypsum, 2,000 pounds or 1 ton per acre applied. Even though we're applying more nutrients with gypsum, calcium and sulfur at that high rate of 2,000 pounds per acre, with a lower rate of polysulphate, we're making more nutrients available quicker during the growing season, because of the release characteristics of polysulphate compared to gypsum. And we see that same difference in release characteristics between polysulphate and gypsum at lower use rates that are more commonly applied to different crops like apples or other specialty crops like potatoes. Next slide, please. There are 2 examples of trials on polysulphate for Honeycrisp apples that have been conducted over the last 2 years in 2022 and 2023. This first example is an orchard in New York, fifth leaf Honeycrisp orchard, where we had simply 2 treatments: a control that was the grower standard soil applied fertility practice, and then the second treatment would be the control with the addition of granular polysulphate. We split the application of polysulphate to 2 different timings during the season to try to target key key times or key processes in apple development and fruiting. Each of those applications, it was 150 pounds of polysulphate per acre, or 300 pounds per acre in total. First application was early in the season at tight cluster, and then in this example of New York, it was mid to late June for the second application. Each application of polysulphate supplied 21 pounds of K2O, nearly 29 pounds of sulfur, 18 pounds of calcium, and nearly 5.5 pounds of magnesium. This was replicated 6 times per treatment, with multiple trees per replication in this New York trial. Next slide, please. So in this particular trial and example, there wasn't a significant difference in yield, overall yield between the 2 treatments. If we look at yield expressed as fruit per tree, the control was about 69 fruit per tree versus nearly 72 fruit per tree for polysulphate. The bigger and more notable difference here is the number of fruit being classified as good fruit or without defect for polysulphate versus the higher number of defect fruit in the control treatment. So we're gaining about 12 additional good fruit per tree for the polysulphate treatment, with corresponding decrease in the defect fruit for the polysulphate treated trees. Next slide, please. So in terms of return or profitability for the grower, the consultant Reality Research calculated the the average dollars per acre return for the control treatment and polysulphate based on the yield and the grading and color as well. And so you see the difference between the control and the polysulphate was approximately additional $900 per acre in gross gross revenue for using polysulphate, and then considering the the typical fertilizer cost for polysulphate, which oftentimes is very minimal, or a lot of, or in many cases no additional cost per acre, considering the other nutrient inputs in a dry fertilizer blend. There's a significant opportunity for Honeycrisp producers to maximize the quality and profitability of their orchard. Next slide, please. For 2023, we moved this trial to Michigan with LTI Ag Research. Again on Honeycrisp, this was a 7th leaf orchard. The same 2 treatments, control versus granular polysulphate. And again, the polysulphate was split into 2 applications, 150 pounds of polysulphate per acre, per application. This particular trial was replicated 4 times, so 4 blocks, and then 5 trees per rep for each treatment. So 20 trees contributing to each average for a treatment. Next slide. Yes, you can advance one, please. So in this example from Michigan, we actually did have a slight increase in yield for polysulphate versus the grower standard. So on the left, yield equivalent expressed as bushels per acre. We went from 1,120 to 1,290 bushels per acre by using polysulphate applied at 300 pounds of total product per acre. And then similar to the previous year's results in New York, when we looked at the fruit quality results depicted on the right side in the graph, we had nearly 71% of the fruit from the polysulphate treatments or polysulphate treatment that were classified as good fruit with no bitter pit versus only 61% of good fruit in the grower standard. The other comment that Ty Wittenbach, who conducted these trials, or the other comment that Ty made relative to the bad fruit for the polysulphate treatments was that while there was still bitter pit present in those bad fruit that had received polysulphate, or the trees that had received polysulphate, it was a reduced area of bitter pit. So there was still a trend or an indication that the quality was improving in those fruit, even though they still had some detectable bitter pit. Next slide, please. All right. So as we wrap up, the key message here is that balanced nutrition is key to all crops. But specific to the conversation this afternoon, balanced nutrition is key to apples. Your nutrients, like nitrogen, like phosphorus, like calcium, all have an important role in determining apple yield, productivity and quality. And with a combination of yield and quality, those obviously impact the potential profitability of apple production. We've covered two topics this afternoon, or two general areas. The first one revolved around precision management of nutrients early in the life of a new orchard to create opportunities to maximize the profitability of that orchard, both in the short term as the orchard's getting established, but also in the long term as we think about practices like fertigation and trying to manage water quality throughout the life of that orchard. The second area focused on fruit quality, specifically using calcium. There's a foliar application or a soil applied application with polysulphate to optimize calcium nutrition and ideally reduce quality disorders like bitter pit that can reduce the economic value of the fruit that are being produced from those orchards. Next slide, please. So thank you. Thank you for your time and attention this afternoon on behalf of ICL Growing Solutions, both in North America, but also the team in Eastern Europe, represented by Diana. We are but two representatives or agronomists for ICL, globally all across the world. We have many colleagues, both in sales and agronomy, like what Diana and I are, that are out in the field every day, working with farmers and retail distributors across the globe to solve these local agronomic challenges with agronomic recommendations and quality products. But as I highlighted at the beginning of the presentation, we often rely on the knowledge and insights of colleagues that may be on the other side of the world in crafting those recommendations or trying to solve those challenges.
Yeah, well, thanks, Jason and Deanna. Certainly, the recognition that there are, those grower connections and talking to colleagues, different parts of the world and different parts of the United States. Certainly, there's a not a one size fits all, but a recognition that there are different climates and different soil types that you're dealing with. So, thanks for that good information. Now, we do have a couple of questions that have been presented. We have one from Ersin in Turkey. He says, thanks for the insightful presentations, first of all. But he's curious if there's any observations regarding the bitter pit damage ratio in fruit, particularly in relation to different rootstocks. Some articles are suggesting that the use of certain rootstocks can reduce the occurrence of bitter pit. And he's interested in if you could share any insights on that, if rootstocks have an effect on the bitter pit occurrence.
Well, before I answer, I'll ask Diana if you have any perspective on this.
I never saw any results in the field, but speaking with the farmers and speaking with my colleague, who is a very good specialist on A+ in Poland, I can recommend the M27 rootstocks, because using this rootstock you can a little reduce the bitter pit, but we don't, as I told, we do not have any trial results and any experience. And of course, I don't know this rootstock exists in Turkey, but in Poland we have this rootstock.
Yeah. So from my side of things, I'm not as familiar with the genetic characteristics of different rootstocks, and this is question that we can certainly follow up on with our colleagues and consultants we work with to see what types of thoughts or input that they might have. But certainly as I've learned more about apples over the last few years, it is clear that there are differences between rootstocks and how they potentially access nutrients from the soil, and then the impact that has on growth and productivity and quality characteristics as well. And I think that's intuitive, or makes a lot of sense, and that the roots are where nutrients access the plant when they're taken up from the soil, and roots have physiological and genetic characteristics that it can influence how they interact with different nutrients.
Yes, we also have an kind of a follow-up question on the salinity issue from Greece. With these salinity problems from water, is polysulphate a useful solution to reduce salinity?
It can be, yeah. So we've had some experience with that in the U.S. and in California again, which is an area that has more issues with salinity compared to other parts of the United States. And the specific example that I'm thinking about was a pistachio orchard, so not apples, but a nut crop. And in that particular trial or experience over 2 years of polysulphate use as a broadcast application of polysulphate on the soil surface, there were some measurable impacts or improvements, reductions, depending on how you want to look at it, in the salinity of the soil. And I think that comes back to the calcium that's contained within polysulphate, and how that calcium is released compared to alternative options like gypsum. The one caveat or thing that I would add is that when you start to focus on using polysulphate as a soil amendment, or particularly for addressing challenges like salinity, as opposed to only focusing on supplying the nutrients that the crop needs, the application rate may need to change. You may need to consider higher rates of polysulphate to achieve those desired outcomes that you need for soil amendment or soil salinity reduction.
Thank you. So we're nearing the end here. If we could have the slide with the QR code. Thank you. And while that is up, and before we wrap it up, we do have another question, one from Dan. Dan says that calcium is an antagonist to potassium and displaces it easily. Apply no foliar potassium during cell division in the ovary immediately following pollination. So foliar applied calcium can move into the developing codling. I hope I'm pronouncing these right. Calcium is the hardest element to move into the plant, so boron needs to be beyond sufficient to activate adequate calcium movement. No potassium foliar unit fruit fill begins approximately 2 to 3 weeks post-bloom. This will control calcium assimilation problems in Honeycrisp and other varieties. So I'm not sure if you have anything to add to that, or if you have a comment about that.
Yeah, I think certainly. I think Dan makes many good points in his comment. I think some of the themes here are the interaction between nutrients, and so going back to one of our earlier slides, we had the classic interaction universe between nutrients and how they synergize each other, antagonize, and certainly calcium and potassium have that interaction, that antagonistic interaction. Potassium and magnesium is another interaction that is often thought of or well understood. And so I think Dan's right in that you have to consider some of these other nutrients and how and when we apply those. As one example, we didn't cover this trial in our presentation today, but we've had some very successful trials of foliar potassium on Haegele apples, increasing fruit size and yield. And so while that approach might be completely appropriate for a variety like Haegele, it might not be the right approach for for Honeycrisp, or we might need to consider a different balance of nutrients in a foliar application for Honeycrisp. And then the last point there is the interaction between calcium and boron, and you considering the adequacy of boron. With boron being a negatively charged nutrient and calcium being positively charged nutrient, we often see or understand that those two nutrients move in combination within the plants.
Dan has a follow-up comment. He says that apparently there was in 2017 study in the USA. It addressed rootstocks for Honeycrisp, B9 in one Geneva rootstock. He thinks maybe it was 935. They had superior calcium uptake.
Thank you.
Good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, I'd like to thank everybody for their comments and their questions. I hope we adequately satisfied your curiosity there. Very fact-filled information presentation, and we appreciate the opportunity for ICL to present some of this information to the industry, and hopefully a lot of takeaways that you can follow up on if you need to. But we appreciate everybody joining us today. I want to thank Jason and Deanna, and again, we just want to say that we really enjoyed having everybody here. So keep an eye out for future webinars from Fruit Growers News via our email list and social media platforms. And I really want to thank ICL for sponsoring the webinar. Very informative again. So thanks for participation, everybody, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
Diana.
Thanks.